This week, Cosmic Enforcer Luna was added to the game, and as a new Transcendence hero, it's always worth asking, how is this hero going to be best used? Now, if you don't already know, if you're a newer player to Idle Heroes, Transcendence heroes are typically expensive and better forms of heroes we already have access to. And Cosmic Enforcer Luna really takes the strengths of what makes assassins good heroes, but unfortunately, assassins are rarely actually that good. In fact, when you look at some of the best assassins in the game, they're actually support heroes, which is really, really weird. Look at heroes like Rogan, who buff speed, crit damage, and attack. And if you take a look at Drake, heroes that debuff opponents, it's weird, because assassins are typically considered big damage dealers, and that's what makes them attractive. But actually, as we've learned and played Idle Heroes more and more and more over the years, it seems that damage is increasingly the least important thing in the game. Now, when you think about high damage heroes, typically you'll be drawn to boss fights, right? Boss fights is where high damage heroes shine, and think of Star Expedition as one of the key game modes for that, and also Void bosses as well. Those two game modes are fundamentally where all the strength of damage dealers comes. Now, unfortunately, if you've ever fought a Void boss before, you'll know that you're not actually fighting a single target. It's multiple opponents, and actually a lot of the time you can consider it more like Seal Land, because you're facing not just this big boss in the middle, but his 4 minions who all annoy you, and therefore functionally it's just like, as I said, fighting Transcendence equivalent of Seal Land. Which then just means that the game mode is not just quite as simple as fighting a boss. In fact, the purest sense of boss fighting we have is Star Expedition. So considering Cosmic Enforcer Luna is a damage dealer, what matters the most then is if she's going to be good against Star Expedition and good against Void bosses. Now there's a lot going on here, but to summarize very simply, whenever one of your allies does a basic attack or active skill, she will inflict an ability called Structural Breakdown on the enemy with the lowest HP. And the way Structural Breakdown works is, depending on the amount of layers it has, it decreases your opponent's armor, decreases their ability to have damage reduction, their ability to dodge, and their all damage reduction. And when that's fully upgraded, that becomes a 50% reduction to all these different things. Now, what immediately stands out to me there is that actually this isn't very good. 50% as a reduction is just a worse version of what Drake is doing, who is not a Transcendence hero and is a Dark hero. And you have to remember, you can run Drake in Star Expedition. So if this was going to be the strategy for using heroes, then people would already be using Drake in Star Expedition. But the main reason they're not doing this is because 100% reduction of these defenses most of the time is not actually an issue. For example, you can overcome block with precision, dodge isn't a thing that the boss can do, and armor is completely avoided with armor break, meaning the only important stats here are damage reduction and all damage reduction. So many people choose not to run Drake because in Star Expedition it's very easy to get to 100% armor break. Especially when you're considering the power of Transcendence heroes, you can literally throw an armor break imprint on a Transcendence hero and get 60% armor break on that hero. Add to that then Guild Tech, Treasure Train, and also Star Spawns. It's pretty easy to reach 100% armor break on a hero. Heck, armor break can even be achieved from the imprints in Star Expedition. So in that sense, you're already losing some of the value from Structural Breakdown. Not to mention, it's only giving you a 50% reduction in armor, not a 100% reduction. So even then, armor break would end up being important. So that's really, really annoying. And the fact you can reduce block, that's not going to help. As I said, we already have precision to do that. So the only important things here are damage reduction and all damage reduction. And in that case, it really makes Cosmic Enforcer Luna not that great if this is the only skill we're focusing on. So in that sense, she's just a worse Drake, and therefore, to me, this is not something you want to be using. And even if you consider game modes where you can't use Drake, like for example, the Void bosses, where you can only use Transcendence heroes, this ability targets the enemy with the lowest HP, which immediately means that it's going to be focusing the little minions rather than the main boss. And typically the main boss is the one you want to kill first because that's the one that causes you the most problems. The minions are easily sorted with someone like a Betty who can crowd control them. So this doesn't help that problem either because it focuses the very heroes we don't want to focus and doesn't focus the boss. So again, not a very helpful ability. So given that we've established the Structural Breakdown isn't going to be that helpful in boss fights because either Drake is better or it's going to be targeting heroes we don't necessarily want to target, let's actually look at what Cosmic Enforcer Luna does when it comes to damage. Because as a support hero, she doesn't seem like she's all that good. Well, the main abilities we need to understand is that Cosmic Enforcer Luna, like Mockman, has multiple forms. She has her Devastating form and her Suppressed form. Devastating form is triggered when she has 100 energy at the start of a fight, and then she switches between these forms basically when she triggers her active skills. So assuming she isn't getting crowd controlled or stopped, during the course of the fight, she'll switch between Devastating and Suppressed form, allowing her to deal more damage in her Devastating form, and when she's in her Suppressed form, she will progressively buff herself with Deified Blade. And that Deified Blade will ultimately give her Overload Outburst, and it will also give her damage dealt. And these different abilities allow her to deal more damage and eventually switch form. Now, it seems like there's a lot going on here, but pretty much to summarize everything she's doing, it's just stacks and stacks and stacks of damage. It's just different forms of damage. So we have Bleed, we have additional damage scaling with her abilities like Deified Blade and Overload Outburst, and ultimately it just comes down to a hero who is focusing on doing as much damage as possible. She's got 3,000 attack damage to one randomly selected enemy, choosing the priority with the most structural breakdown. If she's under Overload Outburst status, she will deal extra damage equal to 90% of that hero's current max HP. Then she'll also inflict 1,500% of attack damage, and then she'll consume her Star Core charge, which she gains when she is in her Devastating form. And then that Star Core's charge will allow her to do Focus Strike, which will deal 6,000% of attack damage, and a crit is guaranteed. So that's quite helpful. So if you boost up her crit damage, she's going to be doing these hits that deal a tremendous amount of single target damage, which is either going to be excellent for executing individual opponents, or it's going to be really helpful in boss fights for dealing as much damage as possible. Now, when you compare her to the best damage dealer for bosses in the game, which is Lord of Fear Aspen, you immediately see she has a few downsides. Because Luna is focusing so much on all these damage statistics, she's not actually bringing anything to the fight to help you with survival, and that's a bit of an issue. Because if you take a look at Lord of Fear Aspen, he's able to steal the attack from opponents, and that's pretty strong. That is a 25% attack steal, which eventually scales up to a 30% attack steal when you get this to Sublime, which is a very, very useful ability. And that's when you're fighting bosses specifically, which means Aspen is very strong against bosses because he debuffs their ability to damage you and also steals all of their attack stats. So the more powerful a boss is, Aspen scales with them because he steals their most important statistic. Now, this therefore is the issue with Luna, is she actually doesn't have anything like that. Most of her stuff is buffing herself or debuffing the opponent's defenses. And the elephant in the room here is that we're not actually struggling for damage in things like Star Expedition. In fact, even with a Vulcan as your main hero, guilds are very easily beating the first 100 stages of Star Expedition. And if you faced the additional 100 waves after that, the boss's difficulty doesn't become dealing damage to him, it becomes survival. And that is a hugely problematic truth, because basically I see Luna having two uses in Star Expedition. One, for people who don't have Lord of Fear Aspen, and two, for people who physically can't live and might only live for 3 rounds, so just go straight into the fight in Devastating form and try to do some damage to the boss, maximizing all the stuff here. But even with that kind of build, that's a build that's just admitting that, okay, I haven't got a big treasure terrain, I haven't got big destiny improvements, I'm not going to live against this boss, so I'll just do what I can. So just because that's going to maximize your damage output in those few rounds, it's not actually going to do all that much in the grand scheme of your guild's abilities, because in fights like Star Expedition, which go on for up to 15 rounds, you want things like Antler's Cane, Freya's buffs to poisoned opponents, Halora to stack Abyssal Corruption onto that enemy, and Heartwatcher to gain as many debuffs as possible, assuming you can even use her in those later stages. Very unlikely. Most people just end up using things like Olivia and Natalie, etc., etc. But even Natalie continues all the buffs thrown onto your hero, so you have a lot of abilities going on against the boss, which ramp up and ramp up and ramp up, and ultimately result in you doing a lot of damage in later rounds. So given all that, what you're basically doing, if you're running Luna to do early damage and then just ultimately die against the later stages of Star Expedition, is investing in something that's still not going to be that impactful for your guild, because the people that will do the big damage are running long-term teams where Aspen can scale up and scale up and scale up, and that is what makes them strong. Now, first of all, that's a very small number of people in Star Expedition that can do that. It's really only a few hundred players that have accounts strong enough to live. Secondly, if you are just trying to cope and do as much damage as you can to this Star Expedition boss with a Luna, is it really worth investing in a hero just for a single game mode where the gain of rewards isn't that good? In my personal opinion, no, it isn't, and I don't think Luna is worth investing in for that reason. For example, to have a competitive Star Expedition lineup, you typically need a Giant Killer hero, so immediately you'd need to get a Giant Killer copy of her. And on top of that, if you go and take a look at her Tenants, you'll see that we're dealing with Yorm Tum, and we have Betty. Now, great! You know what, Betty's a solid tenant. It's good to have her in here, but YUMP's a hero you don't particularly want to be building. But then you need another YUMP for tenant spot 3. Again, an assassin, not very good as a tenant. And then for tenant spot 1, it's Natalie, which is a bit annoying because it means you need a second Natalie, which is a pain. And then you could even go with Luna here, but she's an assassin, so that makes that really not an attractive option. You'd rather have Natalie because she's a ranger, and rangers give better tenant stats. So ultimately, it's just an awkward selection of heroes to have here, which in my opinion, again, is another reason why I wouldn't really want to be building a Luna, because it forces me into YUMP, and it forces me to upgrade my Betty to Tree of Origin 5, and most people choose to keep their Betty at Tree of Origin 1, especially if they're trying to save Stellar Shards. Now, granted, there is some synergy here that you could go with a fun build where Luna is your main hero, and you run Betty to crowd control opponents, and you rely on Luna's ability to kill single enemies, and just keep the rest of the team crowd controlled. I can see that being a fun and enjoyable strategy with Luna. And actually, running a Betty lineup like that does synergize with Luna's abilities, because if you look here, she gains effects every time she does an active skill, and it's these effects that cause her to switch her forms. So if you want to maximize the efficiency of your Luna, you want to be energy feeding her so that she's doing active skills every single round. Now, granted, when she switches forms, she will actually improve her energy by 100, so she even feeds energy into herself, which again synergizes with this kind of combo. So if you're running an energy feed team, which is already synergizing with the Betty, who would be a tenant, which allows the Betty to keep crowd controlling opponents, and then Luna is coming in there and killing opponents, yes, then I can see this actually being a really, really fun team to use. Again, though, that relies on the fact that your opponents can be crowd controlled to maximize on this. But against any enemy in Void Campaign that can be crowd controlled by Betty, then yeah, I can see this being a very viable and enjoyable strategy for dealing with opponents quite effectively. Not to mention that the sheer scale of damage that she's bringing to the fight makes it a little easier to kill those opponents that can be problematic, because she is debuffing them, which is something we haven't seen in Void Campaign before, which does mean you are able to kill those enemies quickly and efficiently once Betty is keeping the rest of the enemy team locked down. However, this sort of strategy will fall short against things like Valkyries or even Sherlocks, who make crowd control a little more difficult, because in Sherlock's case, he reflects crowd control back onto you, and in Valkyrie's case, she's just going to damage you for attempting to crowd control her. But against opponents where Betty actually can successfully crowd control opponents, then yeah, Luna seems like a really fun hero to use in that circumstance, because you get to enjoy Betty as a tenant. So given the fact that Luna has all this damage, and the fact she's going to be focusing enemies one by one, it actually means that the Betty strategy seems fairly synergistic. Now, if you are planning on building your own Luna, you will want to fully sublime her active skill to maximize your damage output. You can see that you're gaining tons of additional damage with Focus Strike. If you do that, getting that extra 10,000% of scaling attack, which targets an opponent's max HP. And bear in mind that this will probably cap out in things like Void Campaign, where enemies have ridiculously high HP stats. On top of that, you're increasing your all damage dealt by doing this as well, and you're giving yourself extra bleed to those targets. Furthermore, as we already saw with Star Power Overdrive, you will want to invest in this to get that energy feed as well, so that passive is super important that you upgrade. Now, given that Luna likes hunting down single targets, it's actually kind of cool that her second passive has the ability to not just break them down defensively, but also join in and add an additional attack to that opponent, depending on what form she's in. It's going to be 600% of attack damage if she's in suppressed form, or damage the scales up to 1500% of her attack, based on the current HP of the target. And the only issue with that is that it actually becomes weaker and weaker and weaker the more damage the enemy has taken. However, against high HP targets, that shouldn't be too much of a problem. And actually, when she's in her devastating form anyway, she's just going to kill them as soon as she attacks, so it's not too much of a problem. But if you do upgrade this, you are going to be dealing extra damage in your suppressed form if the opponent has less than 50% max HP. So that can be very, very helpful. And also, when she chases and attacks in her devastating form, she'll also be able to do extra damage equal to 20% of the target's lost HP as well again. So basically, by upgrading Coordinated Strike, you're doubling her ability to deal damage to opponents, especially when they're low on HP. So if I was building a Luna myself, I don't know if you necessarily need the basic attack improvement. I would rather have a team that just fed energy where she was doing active skills all the time. So I would personally just invest in her active skill, passive 2, passive 3, and only go and do the basic attack if I was going to make her Destiny. But that shouldn't surprise you, as most heroes are like that, because basic attacks are typically the least important abilities, and energy feed is just super strong. So to make Luna work then, it should be clear that you're going to be wanting to absolutely take advantage of the Betty that is going to be needed as a tenant, and also you're going to want a team. So I wouldn't even consider building Luna unless I had 6 Transcendence Heroes on my account. And the big issue is one of them is probably going to have to be MKxJUMP if you want to maximize her efficiency as a homeowner, because then you get both of her tenants. So who would the other 3 be in that circumstance? Assuming we have Betty, MKxJUMP, and Luna, the other 3 heroes I would build alongside her would be Halora, because Halora is able to deal Abyssal Corruption to opponents, which will massively improve our critical strike damage, and also Royal Guard is going to improve our damage dealt as well. So that's going to synergize nicely with us. Also, if we do take damage, we can ping with all our heroes, which again helps that pressure that Luna is doing when she joins in with our heroes as well. So it just adds lots of additional damage to the team. Another hero I would want is Freya, because the more active skills Freya does, the more layers of evolutionary factors she gains, and once she gets up to 3 layers, she's going to improve your damage against poison targets. So if Freya is able to go first, poison the enemies, it's then going to improve the overall damage of your Luna. This is particularly excellent in boss fights like Star Expedition, but it's also very strong because when you get these evolutionary factors, it's going to give you shields, additional damage reduction, and help keep your team alive. Now, granted, once you've managed to achieve a successful lock in the early stages of the fight with Betty CCing opponents, then the Freya becomes less important. But you still want Freya to be quick and attack early and get that damage reduction out, because if you don't have that, then you are going to find yourself in a lot of problems. But of course, the damage bonuses that Freya gives, especially if you can go ahead and fully upgrade Pistols of Stars and get yourself evolutionary factor being put onto your Luna as a damage dealer, that's just going to massively help your team overall. Now, the final hero I would throw into this is probably Elena, as Elena is giving us the ability to dodge opponents' attacks, remove crowd control from us, and also add additional bonuses, which have a myriad of different effects, whether it's shield gain, critical strike damage increases, holy damage increases. There's all sorts of crazy nonsense that is capable of happening if you run an Elena, but the most important reason we run her is so that we can remove control effects from our allies, which will break Betty free in case of any issues that may happen. And also, Elena does allow you to dodge, which synergizes already with the fact that Freya also is able to allow you to dodge against opponents who have Mirage Pollen. So by using Freya and Elena together, we're increasing the survivability of our team, which means it's more likely that we're going to get our attacks out, energy feed our allies, and ultimately do a lot of damage with Luna. The team will want to have 4 Demon Bells or Elusive Mirrors in there to give you consistent energy feed. Betty will want to be wearing an Elusive Mirror in there too. And in the case of Luna, she's probably going to be wanting to run a damage artifact, whether it's a Melodic Strings, an Antler's Cane, or even just if it's like Golden Crown or something just to help her live. There's many, many good options here for Luna, but you could go with a very, very aggressive lineup, assuming you can survive. But given the fact she's a damage dealer, a lot of people these days, when it comes to using damage dealer heroes, they actually want to be running Balance Strike, but because you lose the protection that Unbending Will gives, you probably will want to be running a defensive artifact like Golden Crown to keep her alive. If you can get away with not running Golden Crown, though, that's fantastic, and you can go with Melodic Strings, Antler's Canes, or one of their upgraded equivalents that were released this week. Ultimately then, Luna is a hero that thrives with a team, as it is the team here that allows her to gain layers of structural breakdown and join in and deal additional damage to the opponent. It's the team that's able to energy feed her and allow her to do multiple active skills and therefore switch form more effectively. And in my opinion, I wouldn't go building Luna early. She seems more to me as a late game damage dealer that people will want to run if they're bored of using Aspen as a traditional damage dealer hero and maybe want something a little different for their account. The fact she has Betty as a tenant is fantastic, but she still suffers the same problems that many heroes do as damage dealers, is she is going to rely on the rest of her lineup to be able to shine. Crowd controlling opponents is crucial to Luna's success, and as soon as you face waves that you can't crowd control, it is likely that Luna on her own is not going to succeed well, because when you're so heavily focused on dealing damage, you will not have important abilities that improve your defenses or disruption for opponents, and Luna's doesn't have any of that stuff. The only disruption is stuff that ultimately improves your overall damage dealt by her. Luna is purely a glass cannon one-shot killer that focuses on enemies, which is fun for an assassin hero, but ultimately falls short from what we would expect from Transcendence heroes who we want as our main carry hero. If you have a big team, though, that can make up for these weaknesses, I'm sure she'll be enjoyable, but I don't think she's going to be a top meta pick that's going to be carrying people through the game. She just seems more to me as a fun addition that people can choose to run if they want to, and there will definitely be well-rounded teams that can take advantage of her strengths. If you take a look at her Destiny abilities, you'll see that this just improves even more of her damage, furthering that argument that we want to be utterly obliterating enemies. What's also cool though is we can steal energy with her abilities, so there is some form of disruption here. She also feeds her own energy or gives herself divine retribution, which is true damage, so that's nice. She improves her all damage dealt or her crit damage. Also, if she wanted to, she could improve her own speed, although personally I probably wouldn't want to be buffing her speed. I'd rather Freya and Halora were quicker just for synergy reasons, not to mention that her actual destiny ability, once it triggers with those 12 layers, is going to debuff the opponent further with structural breakdown, assuming they aren't already at 5 layers, and also deal 90% of that enemy's current HP, which is absolutely ridiculous. And of course, that's going to either be a massive amount of damage to low HP targets, or it's just going to be 10,000% of attack damage to high HP targets, which is a win-win, right? It's just a crazy, crazy ability. And you'll see that she has that all over her kit. She's able to deal a lot of damage. First time we've ever seen a 5-figure percentage damage number. So if you're just into big numbers and you want to see this girl shine, she's absolutely a hero for you. But personally, I don't think she's going to be replacing any of the key meta strategies we've already established. Therefore, I would still recommend Doom Terminator Vulcan and Lord of Fear Aspen for those looking for a reliable hero. But if you do have a full team, you do have energy feed, and you do want to take advantage of a Betty, then yeah, go for it. I'm sure Luna could be a really strong hero for you to use. And although I don't think she's going to out-damage Lord of Fear Aspen in Star Expedition, it would be cool to see her get used. And if you still care about dealing damage to the first 100 stages of Star Expedition, she could be pretty fun to test, especially if you have other heroes like Heartwatcher and Ignis and Olivia to either energy feed her or debuff the enemy to make her deal even more damage. Let me know your thoughts about Luna and if she's a hero you're interested in building. I personally won't be building her on any of my accounts, but I think it would be cool to see some of you guys invest in her, especially if you can get a giant killer copy, as she will be dealing a lot of damage, and for accounts that do want to take advantage of that, I just think that she'd be a refreshing, fun hero to use. Then yeah, sure, go for it. As a main damage dealer, she's not really my style, but I'm sure plenty of people will enjoy her single target, high focus damage. The only issue is what you do with the other 5 enemies she's not going to be attacking, but with someone like Betty to crowd control them, perhaps there's a way that you can make her work. I'll see you next time. Hopefully you found this video helpful, and if you do end up building Luna because of this, I'd love to see your account in an account review. You can find more information about that in our Discord. I'll see you next time, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, and of course, have an amazing week, and happy island.